The sun was already starting to set as people hurried down the crowded street, weaving through one another with silent urgency, all drawn to the glow of the only working ATM within miles. The city's recent electricity shortages had thrown neighborhoods into chaos, and residents were left scrambling for access to basic services. The line in front of the ATM stretched far across the pavement, a human chain of worry and weariness. Among those in line was Aisha, a young woman no older than 26, dressed modestly in a beige shalwar kameez, her hijab slightly slipping as the wind tugged at its edges. Her hands were calloused from years of factory labor, her eyes dark with fatigue, but tonight she stood quietly, not for herself but for her aging father whose heart medicine was almost finished. The money she'd managed to save just barely was enough for a refill, but only if she could withdraw it before the pharmacy closed. She clenched her purse tighter as the line crept forward in excruciating inches. The faces around her reflected the same tension: overdue bills, empty fridges, school fees unpaid. Just as she neared the front, a man stumbled into the scene. Disheveled, tall but hunched, his face covered in a tangle of hair and dust, he looked completely out of place in the clean rows of anxious people. Without saying a word, he moved toward the front of the line. Angry shouts erupted. "What do you think you are? There's a line, buddy. Get back." But before it could get ugly, Aisha stepped aside gently and said, "Let him go ahead. Maybe it's urgent." The man turned to her slowly, eyes sunken and tired, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "Thank you," he whispered, almost inaudibly. No one else said a word. The crowd reluctantly let him pass, and in that one moment of silent defiance, Aisha had no idea she had just opened a door to something far beyond her comprehension. Asterisk as the man stood before the ATM. It became clear to Aisha and to a few others watching curiously that he wasn't actually there to withdraw money. He fumbled in his pockets, pulling out a wallet that looked too expensive for the state he was in. It was worn now, creased like the lines on his face, but the leather still held the ghost of wealth. He opened it with trembling hands and stared inside, as if he expected something to magically appear. But the wallet was empty except for a faded photograph of a little girl with bright eyes and a toothy grin. He didn't even pull out a bank card. Instead, he leaned forward, resting both hands against the cold surface of the ATM, breathing heavily. People in the line murmured behind him. A few laughed cruelly. "Lost his mind," someone muttered. "Probably a junkie," said another. Aisha stood still, eyes locked on the man, heart tugging with something she couldn't explain. There was sorrow in his posture, yes, but also something deeper, an emptiness, a silent scream that didn't reach his lips. After a moment, the man stepped aside, sat down slowly on the concrete bench nearby, and buried his face in his hands. His shoulders shook slightly, and Aisha, moved by something primal and instinctive, stepped out of line and approached him. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. The man didn't respond at first, but after a long pause, he lifted his face. His eyes were red, but not just from crying. They were bloodshot from exhaustion, despair, maybe even hunger. "I had everything," he said finally, voice hoarse. "Company, cars, family, and in 6 months, it's all gone." Aisha said nothing, letting the silence hold space for his words. My name's Ramesh Khan. I used to own RK Textiles. Now, I can't even afford to eat." Aisha blinked. RK Textiles was once one of the largest fabric suppliers in Karachi. She remembered seeing the logo printed on the cotton rolls at the factory where she worked part-time. The man in front of her had been a millionaire once. She struggled to reconcile that image with the ragged, broken figure sitting on the bench. "What happened?" she asked gently. Ramesh sighed deeply. "My daughter died in a car accident. My wife blamed me. She left. My business partner, he saw an opening, betrayed me. Emptied the accounts, sold the shares without my knowledge. I tried to fight, but grief doesn't make you strong, it eats you. I lost everything before I could even realize it." Gave a bitter laugh. "Now I'm here, begging the ATM to show me a miracle." Aisha looked down at her own wallet. There wasn't much, just enough for her father's medicine, and maybe a little food for the next day. But something stirred in her chest, something louder than fear. She pulled out a few crumpled notes and pressed them into Ramiz's hand. "Please," she said, "eat something tonight. There's a small tandoor around the corner. Tell them Aisha sent you." Ramiz stared at the money like it was gold. His lip trembled. "Why would you do this?" he asked. Aisha gave a small smile. "Because I know what it feels like to be invisible, and no one deserves to stay that way." The night air carried a slight chill as Aisha walked away from the ATM, her heart heavy yet oddly calm. She didn't know if she'd done something wise or foolish by giving away part of the money she desperately needed, but in that moment, seeing the raw pain in Ramiz's eyes, she couldn't ignore the quiet voice within her that said, "Do what you wish someone would do for you." The pharmacy was still open, and she was able to buy half of her father's medication, promising herself she'd earn the rest somehow over the weekend. As she walked the cracked pavement back to their tiny apartment, her thoughts stayed with the broken man on the bench. What haunted her wasn't just his loss, but how swiftly life had stripped him of everything, like a thief in the dark. Had grown up poor, never knowing wealth, but somehow that night taught her that even the rich weren't safe from tragedy. Over the next few days, Aisha returned to her routine, waking at dawn to wash clothes for 3 households, tending her afternoon shift at the garment factory, then helping her father with his therapy exercises at night. Life moved on, demanding everything as it always did, but something was different. She started noticing people more than worn-out man selling fruit under the flyover, the old woman dozing off in the bus stop corner with a bag of unsold bangles. She started greeting them, sometimes offering a leftover roti, sometimes just a kind word. A strange peace grew inside her, not because her struggles lessened, but because her heart had opened wider. A week later, on a dusty afternoon after her factory shift, Aisha returned home to find a small, clean envelope slipped under her door. She opened it cautiously. Inside was a handwritten note that simply said, "Your kindness fed more than my stomach, Ramiz." Alongside it was a receipt for a deposit made to the neighborhood pharmacy, covering the full cost of her father's medicines for the next 3 months. She gasped and pressed the envelope to her chest. Her knees buckled, and she sat down on the floor, tears welling up in her eyes. He had remembered. He had found a way. She didn't know how. Maybe he borrowed, maybe he sold something, but Ramiz had kept his word. Her act of empathy, so small and quiet, had returned to her multiplied. For the first time in years, Aisha allowed herself to hope. Maybe kindness wasn't just a noble act in a cruel world. Maybe it was the very thing that kept the world from falling apart. In the weeks that followed, a quiet but powerful partnership began to blossom between Aisha and Ramiz. It started with her visiting his fabric stall every few days, not to accept more gifts, but to help him arrange cloth, talk to customers, and offer suggestions for prints and colors that would appeal to everyday women like herself. She had an eye for simplicity, for designs that blended grace with practicality. "You understand what real women wear," Ramiz told her one afternoon as they folded bolts of summer lawn under the fading light. "That's something I never truly saw before. I was too busy chasing corporate buyers and flashy boutiques." Aisha shrugged, smiling shyly. "Miami always said, beauty lives in what's worn with purpose." Ramiz nodded slowly, letting her words sink in. What started as casual help evolved into something more defined. He offered to pay her part-time for her input and labor. And though she was hesitant at first, Aisha accepted, knowing the extra income could help her father and reduce her shifts at the garment factory. Together, they began developing a small but loyal customer base. Local tailors, housewives, working women who appreciated the honesty of their product and the warmth of their approach. But it wasn't all smooth. Some days, sales were dismal, and Ramiz would slump behind the counter, shadows of doubt returning to his face. Aisha would sit beside him then, quietly recounting stories of people from her neighborhood women who managed entire households on a single salary. Girls who walked miles just to attend school, grandmothers who stitched blankets by candlelight. "They don't give up," she'd whisper. "So we won't either." Slowly, Ramiz began to believe again. He registered the business officially, under the name RKNA Fabrics, the A standing for Amana, or trust, though both he and Aisha knew it meant more than that. Her presence had become his anchor, her unwavering strength, the thread stitching his broken pieces back together. As their work expanded, he rented a small room nearby to keep inventory and began hiring local women who needed part-time income, training them to sort and package orders. What began as one man's humble stall was now a growing collective effort rooted in resilience and shared dignity. But more than the profits or praise, what moved Ramiz most was this simple truth. He was no longer alone. And neither was Aisha. Just. When life seemed to be turning a gentler page, a sudden storm strewed one that tested everything they had built together. It was a Monday morning when Ramiz received a legal notice at his stall. A rival fabric wholesaler, once a friend, now a bitter competitor from his past, had filed a case claiming that RK&A Fabrics was operating on intellectual property he had supposedly acquired when Ramiz's original company dissolved. Saying I don't even have the right to my own name, Ramiz said bitterly, slamming the letter down on the counter. His face was pale, his voice a mixture of disbelief and rage. Aisha read the paper slowly, her brows furrowing. He waited. Until you stood back up, she said quietly. And now he wants to knock you down again. Ramis ran a trembling hand through his hair. If this goes to court, I'll lose everything. I don't have the money to fight back. I barely recovered from last time. A heavy silence fell between them. Outside, the sky darkened as clouds loomed. The weight of past betrayal pressed heavily on Ramiz's shoulders, threatening to collapse the fragile hope he'd rebuilt. But Aisha didn't flinch. Instead, she picked up the letter and said firmly, "Then we fight. Not with lawyers, not with anger, but with the truth." Over the next few days, Aisha helped him gather old invoices, hand-drawn designs, and faded photos of the original RK Textiles showroom, proof that the business they'd built now was a continuation of what once was not a theft. She contacted the local tailors and vendors who had worked with both companies and asked for written statements. "Why are you doing all this?" Mies asked her one night as they sorted through piles of documents on the floor of the small inventory room. "Because you stood back up," she replied, her voice steady. "You didn't lie down when life crushed you. You chose to start again with honesty. That deserves defending." The hearing was scheduled for the end of the month. They couldn't afford a high-profile lawyer, so Ramaya stood before the local magistrate with shaking hands, reading a heartfelt statement about loss, betrayal, and rebuilding from ashes. Aisha sat in the front row, her eyes locked on him like a lighthouse in a storm. When he finished, the courtroom was silent. The judge took a long pause before announcing that the case was being dismissed, citing insufficient evidence and acknowledging Ramiz's long-standing reputation and community support. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he walked out of the courtroom. Aisha stood there waiting, holding out her hand. "We just survived our first storm," she said, smiling through her own tears. "And we're still standing." After the court victory, something shifted between Aisha and Ramiz, not instantly. Not dramatically, but in quiet, lingering glances and subtle gestures. The kind that bloom when two souls slowly begin to trust not only the future, but each other. They never spoke of love directly. There was no grand confession, no whirlwind romance. But there were moments like when Ramiz began waiting outside her factory at night just to walk her home. Or when Aisha started bringing 2 lunchboxes instead of 1, pretending it was by mistake. The world around them remained chaotic, unpredictable, but in their shared space, a cramped storeroom turned workshop. A street stall lit with string lights, a borrowed bench in the local park, they'd found rhythm. They found peace. One evening, as monsoon rain tapped gently against the windows of the fabric room, Ramiz finally spoke what had long been simmering in his heart. "I used to think love was something loud," he said, handing her a cup of chai, like fireworks. "Now I think it's more like this. Steady, present, needed." Aisha looked down at her cup, then into his eyes. "I've never known love to be soft," she said honestly. "But maybe that's because I've only seen it bruised." He reached out gently, his fingers brushing hers. Maybe we can unlearn that together, but even then they didn't rush. There were still battles to fight, bills to pay, parents to care for, dreams to stitch one thread at a time, and both carried scars that made them cautious, yet their connection deepened in small, deliberate steps. Together they expanded the business into a corner shop, modest but tidy, with walls painted in soft cream and sky blue, the colors of beginning again. Aisha taught Rameez how to read fabric through a woman's eye, where the seam would fall, what fabric itched in summer, what design made a girl feel beautiful. And Rameez taught her about invoices, accounts, logistics, things she'd always taught, assumed were beyond her reach. "You're the reason this place breathes," he told her one day. "I'm just the hands. You're the heartbeat." Aisha smiled at him, then not shyly, but fully, like someone who had finally accepted that she was allowed to take up space in this world, and maybe even in someone's heart. It wasn't about being rescued, it never had been. It was about recognition, about choosing each other, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. And slowly, the ache of yesterday faded into something softer, a memory, yes, but no longer a wound. Asterisk. A year later, on a golden winter morning, the corner where Ramiz once sat, broken and hopeless by the ATM, looked different. The fabric shop now had a painted wooden sign that read RK and a woven with dignity. Inside, the once modest room bustled with quiet energy shelves full of vibrant prints, women laughing as they measured lengths of cloth. A tiny office in the back where Aisha now handled orders from across the city. Their venture had grown not into an empire but into something far more meaningful, a sanctuary built on second chances. One afternoon, as Aisha arranged a new shipment, a soft knock came at the door. An older woman stood there in a tattered shawl, holding a child whose nose was red from the cold. "I'm sorry," she said timidly. "I'm not here to buy, but my husband lost his job, and we have nothing for our son. I saw your sign. I just thought maybe—" Aisha didn't hesitate. She stepped outside, gently took the woman's hand, and brought her inside. She pulled out 2 rolls of fabric from the clearance shelf, handed her a few stitched children's pieces they'd made for display, and packed them in a recycled shopping bag. "You're not alone," she said quietly. "We've been there too." Ramiz, watching from behind the curtain, felt a familiar lump in his throat. Later that evening, when the shop was closed and the lights dimmed, he sat beside Aisha on the floor of the workspace, just like they used to in the beginning. "Do you ever think," he said softly, "how strange it was that you let a stranger cut in line that day?" Aisha chuckled. "I thought you were going to faint. Looked like a broken kite about to fall." He laughed, then turned serious. "I wasn't just broke, I was gone. But that moment your kindness had stitched something back into me. You didn't see a millionaire or a failure. You just saw someone hurting." Aisha turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "And you didn't see a poor girl or a nobody, you saw me." They sat in silence for a long moment, surrounded by the scent of fabric and old chai, the soft rustle of hope hanging in the air. Rami said, taking her hand. "I still have that photo of my daughter in my wallet. When I lost her, I thought my story had ended, but it hadn't. It just needed a new beginning." Aisha leaned her head on his shoulder. Sometimes she murmured, "The smallest choices lead us back to ourselves." Outside the city, moved on, honking, shouting, chasing, but in that quiet corner of Karachi. 2 people who had once been strangers now sat side by side, not as rescuer and rescued, not as employer and employee, but as equals, as partners, as survivors who had learned that the most priceless things in life, dignity, empathy, trust, can't be bought or lost in a bank account. They can only be shared. And that, more than anything, is what made them rich.